Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Process. If you remember, we have these 4 magic card thumbnails, and today we'll be choosing this one to take to this final just using Photoshop brushes and digital painting techniques. So let's check it out. Alright, as we like to start off, we always have our set of references, and today I'm using this classic painting that has a beautiful color palette that I've sort of narrow down into these major swatches. So I'll be utilizing some very key photo reference of beautiful gnarled up trees that I'll be using for the painting, and using the color palette for this overall direction. So I'm just going to start off spending some time really taking care of the sketch, right? Initially, when I was doing the thumbnail, it was mostly about composition and trying to figure out overall color palette. But now that I'm redrawing the sketch, what I'm going to focus on this time is something called rhythm, giving things a little bit more of a gesture and a movement, something a little bit more exaggerated. Now that I have my rough sketch in, you can see that I'm putting down my major values. And yes, I have the original thumbnail that I'm really utilizing a lot of the key values from, but I'm also using the swatches from the painting reference to get some more color variation in my piece. So right now I'm just kind of laying in a lot of different values and colors to sort of get the washing down, to be able to build up the foreground, middle ground, background in a way where the values sort of make them more visible, right? So we can really rely on good value structure to do that versus anything else. Now, as we're working through this image, I've started to actually pay attention to a little bit more of the trees now. So the trees, I'm going to be laying in and using a darker value to really make sure they pop in terms of the silhouette. One of the things about silhouette is that we need contrast. And contrast is important in a way where if there's something light, we need something dark next to it to really get that pop of contrast. And you can see that bright green triangle over in the distant rune that has that surface of light, and right next to it is a darker value, hopefully creating that sense of contrast that we'd love to see. Now in the trees, I'm thinking they're in the foreground, a little bit more in the shadows. So I want to really control that value structure so it's overall in a darker value range, but we still get to see a lot of the values, so we can see form, we can see details, and just see the cool elements that make it a interesting looking tree. So I'll be using some darker values and lighter values. The lighter values, I've kind of cooled them down more in a desaturated purple gray zone. To me, that feels like it's in the shadows. Kind of cooler, more in a damp, darker part of like a forest or a jungle or something. Now, I'm also utilizing a lot of darker values, more of these to bring up the dark accents. The dark accents that would be in the shadows or in the cast shadows as well. These dark accents, I feel, bring a lot of personality, and as I'm looking at the photo reference, I could really see those dark accents being very prevalent, very, very visible. And one thing about photo reference is important, that don't just copy what you see, but really start to try to understand it so that later on when you're doing a painting or another piece of art from, with maybe less reference, you can utilize the steps that we've learned in this study or in this painting to kind of apply into a future part, right? So I think those are all really important. Now, as I'm getting form, the important thing to remember is that these trees are not just sticking up and down, right? They're moving up and into the distance, and they're twisting and turning. There's a lot of foreshortening. So I really want to make sure that I'm doing as much as I can to really describe the form in the proper way. I know in art classes, we always talk about describing form the proper way, but sometimes it's a little ambiguous, right? It's not always as clear as it seems, or, to me at least, it wasn't always that clear. So having, a little bit more of an understandable way to put it all together, such as, make sure that the tree parts that are going vertical are a little bit darker, and the ones that are going more into the distance, that would be perpendicular to the light source, maybe the sky, can catch a little bit more of that ambient light. So that's sort of the structure that I'm going to be using. Now we're on to some details on the trees. These details are excellent ways to bring out focal points, to bring out believability, because not only are we trying to use strong silhouettes so that we could see these details, but we're also using really, really, really well-designed silhouettes so that they have that believability automatically just within the shape design. So I want to make sure that I'm spending a good ample amount of time here. I don't want to rush things. Being too fast or being in a rush never really helps the painting. And in fact, sometimes when I feel like I'm in a rush, I go too fast, and I find myself going back to that part that I went too fast and redoing it, So what does that teach me? It almost teaches me just to slow down a little bit in the beginning and just make sure that I'm not doing anything 2, 3, or 4 times over that really kind of eats up a lot of my time budget. So I just want to make sure before I move on to doing another part of the composition or another element in the painting, I just want to make sure that these trees are in a good enough spot where I feel very confident it's at a spot where it's as far as I could take it, Then the rest of the image will kind of develop, and then I'll maybe come back to the trees, because then I'll see more information that might need to be pushed, or I might see some details that I might want to add. Again, art is like this organic process at times, and as much as we like to have a 1, 2, 3, step type of method, sometimes it is this organic process where we go forward and back and forward and back. Now, with any complex painting, it's important that we always emphasize the simplicity, right? So as I zoom out, I just want to make sure that I'm getting the read of these big triangular diamond-shaped runes. That is the whole focal point of this painting. It's the whole purpose of the painting. So I just want to make sure we're not losing that, because if we did, well, then it wouldn't be the same painting, right? It would be a different approach. All right. So as we're trying to figure out the value structure here, one of the things that's important is, making sure everything is reading. And so I was struggling a little bit trying to find the right value structure for the lower part of the rune that I'm working on right now. But I think with a little bit of experimenting and also going back to the thumbnail, which kind of has all of the initial answers that I put down, I want to go back to that and just make sure that I'm staying true to that. Now, one thing about concept art and design is that when we do thumbnails for a client, guess what they expect to see as the final result? Something very, very, very close, if not exactly the same, just with more detail of what the thumbnail is. And I think that was a big learning curve for me, trying to adapt that into my professional workflow, because as we all know, artists, some of these pieces change like as you go from the thumbnail to the final. And so, I think practicing thumbnails and practicing getting the thumbnail to a final version without changing too much is a really good discipline to practice as a concept artist in the field. As an artist doing it for your own personal work, you can change things all the time, and I actually think there's great value in exploring that. All right, so what I want to try to do here is I'm not going to be using any photos for textures. However, I will be using some elements to be able to grab silhouettes, these shapes and rhythms that would be best used if I could have a selection just like that. Having the marching ants, the marquee tool, being able to paint inside a shadow, and also maybe on another layer painting inside of the light tones with good control. With a digital painting like this, knowing Photoshop well and having it kind of work to your advantage is a really good plus. Photoshop has layers. We should use layers to our maximum advantage. We can clip, we can isolate silhouettes, we can do so many things that I think is valuable to the process. And I like to do it only in specific areas. So for these runes, because it is the focal point and because it is an area that will have a lot of the detail, right? I think it's so important that we spend the right time to get the layering to work in our advantage. Now I'm putting down the rune details and I'm distorting it, putting it into perspective, but I noticed a really big mistake. I grabbed just like the bottom two sections of the original texture rather than grabbing the whole triangle, which made distorting it into space actually quite difficult. So I came to my senses and just did a whole new pass of laying this down all at once so that I can just lay it down, make sure all the perspective is right, and then just get into the layers to isolate, that element. All right. So just like that, with the shadow details, the element starts to read and has like a lot of sense of detail in it. It looks like a carving that has centuries and centuries of like meticulous work, So that's kind of the sensibility that I wanted to get, and I hope it's communicating across. I also wanted to make sure it felt weathered and old, and there's probably stains on it and dirt pile up and just these inconsistent areas of light and dark and saturated and desaturated. That's what makes things feel kind of old, right? When we kind of have that kind of sensibility. So I feel like we're at a great spot trying to do that, and so that's what I'm adding in. Isolating the light parts of the painting really make it a lot easier to do that. If this is all merged into one layer, it would be kind of a nightmare to tackle those runes. So I'm glad that we did the proper preparation ahead of time. As you know, all of our paintings have proper preparation. We find photo reference, assets, anything that we need that is important to the piece that we can prepare ahead of time will always save so much time through the creative process. All right, let's move to this foreground. Well, not the foreground. I guess the rune that's in front of the one behind it. So now this one's more in the shadow. We're working with different senses of details and different senses of lighting here. All right. So this rune is a little bit more in the shadows. We're not going to have as much contrast. So I want to make sure that we get the right read. So that's why I keep zooming in and out. And I know it's a little probably disorientating because I'm zooming in and out quite quickly. But it's a way to check if the decisions that we're making are becoming accurate, rather than having a unpleasant surprise at the end of the painting, we can see how the decisions are piling up with each other. If they're headed in the right direction or in a different direction, we can see that when we zoom out and look at it as more of a thumbnail view, something really, really small, Now, just as a pre-warning, I will be constantly fighting the battle between runes and tree read together here. All right, the trees have complexity to them, but it's more on a silhouette. The outer shape is very complex. The runes, the shape is simple, but all the detail is inside of the silhouette. Right, so we're dealing with different problems here. And as a concept artist, we are problem solvers. So let's create good solutions for how to do this. All right. So the first thing that I want to do is make sure that let's get all the details in there. And I will take a pass of editing in which I will tone down the details in certain areas so that we can play a balance of detail and areas of rest, right? Kind of that contrast. So things like cast shadows, where you can just swallow up a whole area of detail and make it very, very simplified. Things like that are great strategies to use. And I'll be using a whole ton of strategies trying to figure that part out. Doing different things to the ground plane. Now, I do have a question for you guys. As I was working on this painting, I realized that I didn't figure out the ground in the thumbnail. Okay, and as a final painting, we can't just leave it very ambiguous. So I went through a few variations. Now, I get a lot of questions in my classes about, James, what if you have a better thought? Or what if there's a thought that you have that might be, more suitable for the concept? What do? Do you just do it and show it to them and hope that they like it? What my answer is to that is, if I have an area of the painting that I think could use a little bit of development, first things first is I would go in the direction that's initially implied in the brief, and then I will create maybe one or two quick variations that still fit the theme, but the director or the art director can look at it and make a choice while looking at it, not theoretically thinking about it. It's kind of hard. So rather than having someone think about it and give me the answer, I'll take the initiative to create a couple of options, right? Keeping in mind time management, don't want to go too far deep into those, but you don't want to spend too much time on iterations that are just samples. So I have a question. The question for you guys is, which sample looks the best? And I'll show you guys at the end of the video. I made a few different variations, and they're not too different because it's just part on the ground. But as I was wrapping up this painting, part of these parts were really bothering me, and I'll get into that part later. The question is can you guys give me your vote on which one you think looks best? All right, so we're adding in more tree silhouettes. I thought, what best way to really create a sense of this world than by adding more trees in the far background so we can really get this world to open up, not just end at that last room. There's more things going on, right? And in my other videos, I talk about what art directors like to see inside of environment design, what kind of things that we could see outside of the canvas. So definitely check out other videos talking about that. But that's the mentality that we want to try to use. We want to try to be able to not just make a cool illustration or a concept, but world build. And that's a really deep topic that I get into a lot in my classes, which is we're trying to build a world. Anyway, back to the trees. So these trees are now, I'm looking at the tree reference. You can kind of see it peeping over to the left there. But I'm looking at these details, Before it was shapes and I was looking at light and dark. Now I'm looking at specific details that sit in the light side, the light side of the form. And I want to make sure that I'm getting that sensibility, because when I'm looking at the photos there, I'm just like, wow, those look really, really, really cool. So we're in a good spot. Now, as I'm zooming in here, we can kind of see that it's pretty painterly. There's a lot of just brush strokes being piled up, hopefully making a good sense of form. The thing is, with the rune, it's a lot more controlled, So I think, as I'm developing the details in the trees, I'm gonna have to tone it down a little bit. There's a little bit too much noise everywhere, and I'm starting to see that now, but I'll address that kind of later on. Editing is one of those things where I think, if we need to tone things down, if we need to just put a little value wash on top, I'll do those things at the end, after adding in the details. I'll just keep on my train of thought here and then adjust the values a little bit later. But as you can see right now, what's really important is these light sides of the tree become activated, right? The activation makes us look there, so that sort of bottom left quadrant where the trees are lit, our eye's going to probably spend a little bit more time there looking at that tree because it does have light on it. That light becomes something visible, something tangible, something like, oh, I could step on that tree and walk on it if I needed to get to the rune, Anyhow, so seeing that I think is pretty cool, And obviously the shadow sides become the opposite effect. Our eye doesn't look there as much. It still needs to look there to read and understand the information, but it doesn't need like all of that clarity. So in a way, our eye is going to look more at the stuff in the light and a little bit less at the stuff in the details. So that's a good way for me to at least control how I paint and how I control the development of the painting. One more rune in the background. Let's do a 1, 2, and a nice round number for a number 3. Let's get that back there. And you can almost see how it creates like this fanning pattern. Boom, 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 right? And I kind of like that. It creates another rhythm, right? And you're almost thinking, well, is that on purpose? Is it an arrangement of these runes by some, celestial god? Well, that's up to us to find out. And that's the world building thing that happens where it makes people think, and it makes people really inquire about it. So more tones. We're getting to a point where this painting is getting super, super solidified. I feel like we're about 80% through, and it happened actually quite quickly. But the real design, everybody, really happened in the thumbnail. In video, I'm just showing you guys how I would paint this up if it were now being submitted for a final review. But you have to remember, a lot of paintings, the decisions, the problem solving happens in the first, I would say, 20 minutes, where you're just putting down shapes. Now, as we're going through, just doing a little bit more refinement, I'm playing around with the water reed down there. I want to make sure that it feels like there's like an understandable ground plane, whether it's water or ground or rocks. Just want something there that has that reed. Also, the trees are really busy, so I'm actually trying to create some areas of rest and some areas of complexity, which is going to basically be the trees. Now, seeing the reflections there, it adds a little bit more complexity. We're adding a different material. Now there's wood, there's stone, and now there's water. So thinking about stuff like this is really important because they're all going to have different qualities, meaning that you're probably going to paint them in a couple of different ways. So yeah, I'm like, oh, cool. It's sticking pretty close to the overall direction of the thumbnail, which I really, really love. I love that fact. All right, everybody, I need a huge favor from you. I need your vote. I did 4 different variations of this painting with a subtle different ground plane and tree subtleties. And I would love to get your vote on which one you think looks best. So let me just kind of explain really quickly. But I have a version over here with just the basics, the tree, the runes, and the water. And I started to add in a couple more tree roots thinking it might be a cool look. So then I just doubled down on that. And I was thinking maybe that's too much, and I just took it all out and just made the rune extend all the way down to be on the canvas. So those are the 4 variations. You can take a look at them all right here, but I would love to get your vote. Please let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe. Let me know what else you would like to see in the comments, and I will do my best to make some video or content about it. Anyhow, thank you for joining me on this really fun episode of just pure digital painting, having fun with some magic card, and thanks again. We'll see you guys on another episode of The Process. Thanks again.